Alright, so today I wanted to talk about a Yu-Gi-Oh thought that I've had for loads of years, really, and it just comes up usually when I'm just chatting with friends or other, fellow players at the card shop, online, all kinds of places, and that's this idea that there are basically two, I don't know what this is for, two Yu-Gi-Ohs, two different Yu-Gi-Oh TCG games, and that they can be split roughly between like eras or time periods. So I guess to rewind a bit, this basically comes from this idea that like you read online all the time that like Yu-Gi-Oh has changed too much. Yu-Gi-Oh is different now. Yu-Gi-Oh's maybe gone off the deep end and the power creep has gone too far. The game has gotten too fast. Too many special summons, too many negates, too many hand traps, too much, sacky, fast games, long combos, what have you. And then you've got, those same people who kind of yearn for a return to form for Yu-Gi-Oh! Return to the good old days, which, can vary depending on who you ask what exact time period that is and exactly what that constitutes. Many people think of, trap cards being relevant back then. Setting your traps, things like Bottomless Trap Hole or Dimensional Prison, Mirror Force or Eternal Tribute. People think of, slow gains in card advantage. Cards like Dekoichi or Gravekeeper Spy being really powerful cards you could set. They might think of, advantage being like a number of small one-for-one exchanges, cards like MST or Smashing Ground being used. Boss monsters not coming out until the third or fourth turn of a duel and not having, insane levels of protection or negating everything. Some boss monsters that might come to mind would be something like Dark Armed Dragon, or maybe earlier than that, even Monarchs, kind of forming like a bridge between boss monsters and just regular monsters. And, a slower pace, those sorts of things. I'm not here to say one is better, but rather to say that I think that they really do represent two different Yu-Gi-Ohs that have two different sets of priorities, sets of just skill sets, I suppose you could say. Card pools almost. So, yeah. Now, if you hear me say all this, you might think, oh, well, he's just one of these Yugi boomers who just says, like, we need to go back to T-set pass or, vanilla beatdown or whatever. No, that's not really what I mean, but rather that just today's Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a different game, and you kind of almost have to keep that in mind when you're making the decision maybe to introduce a friend to it, like a returning friend, or the decision, or like how you view the validity of skill or tournament results, all kinds of things. Hopefully, we'll be able to get into all of it. It's gonna probably be a wild all around this discussion without a lot of tracking or pace. So I'm just gonna talk. Okay. The first thing I would say that's like different between these two Yu-Gi-Oh types is that old Yu-Gi-Oh was slower and a little bit more methodical. I'm using that word generally because I think the new Yu-Gi-Oh also has a lot of these elements. It's just a little bit differently packaged. So in old Yu-Gi-Oh, your first turn tended to need to be something safe. You're discouraged from overextending, but you are encouraged to set up a play that will put you in a pretty good position for the next turn. So this is where your old school card like Dekoichi, the Battle Chanted Locomotive, or a Gravekeeper Spy, or some sort of card like that could be really useful. If you set it, it can get you another monster or a draw or some type of advantage for next turn. You could also maybe set a monster that can destroy a card. So say Raiko Lightsworn Hunter, that comes to mind, or in later years, things like Snowman Eater, or even like Legendary Jiu-Jitsu Master. These are just some of my favorites that come to mind. So setting was a very valid strategy, and that was a thing. Also, trap cards. Trap cards were fairly prevalent. It was obviously, the slow speed of trap cards that we cite today as a reason why they aren't often used was not so much the case back then. Setting Bottomless Trap Hole, Dimensional Prison, Mirror Force, and Torrential were very common moves, and as a player, you not only had to have counters to them, but you had to just be aware of them. The best players were oftentimes able to scout out a Mirror Force or a Torrential Tribute by, say, switching your monsters to defense position before you attack, so you only attack with a few of them. Or, summoning monsters one at a time instead of, going crazy. And that way, if they had Torrential Tribute, they'd be harder and harder pressed to, pick when to use it. And if you didn't summon a monster in a given turn, you kept attacking, then you could maybe deduce that, it seems like they have Torrential Tribute set or Bottomless Trap Hole set because I'm not summoning any more monsters, I'm still getting attacks in, they clearly have nothing that can stop me here. Little exchanges like that were a lot of fun for me as a player back in this period of time. There are also other things. Spell and trap removal was a little bit more reserved. So basically you had cards like Heavy Storm that were legal for a good long period of time, and those cards dissuaded you from setting all of your spells and traps. If you set, 2 or more spell and trap cards, especially on like your first turn or something, you could easily get blown out by a Heavy Storm. And if a Heavy Storm hit like 3 or more cards, that was oftentimes just a game. Very powerful thing, but other than that, you only had cards like Mystical Space Typhoon to get rid of one spell or trap card. So you had to use it wisely. You needed to make sure that you saved your Mystical Space Typhoon for cards that truly seemed lethal. There were a lot of ways that you could use Mystical Space Typhoon offensively and defensively, and that nuance was something that sort of changed over time. There were different periods of time where certain cards were more of a threat or less of a threat. Side decking oftentimes included siding in a card like Dust Tornado or Twister to deal with early floodgates like Macrocosmos or Dimensional Fissure, or just a deck that used a few more trap cards than you were comfortable dealing with. And so that's one of those facets of that period of time. Also, boss monsters. So the idea with boss monsters back in the day was that they were oftentimes monsters that were sort of brought out to cement a game state or perhaps just end the game entirely. So the example I mentioned was Dark Armed Dragon, but there are, of course, plenty of others. When Synchro monsters came out, many Synchros were just considered boss monsters, and that was fine. But yeah, well, just going with the Dark Armed Dragon example, the idea with Dark Armed Dragon was that, yeah, it was a powerful card and all that, but you kind of wanted your opponent to have wasted a few of their resources, or maybe committed a few of their resources into the game, and then when you dropped Dark Armed Dragon, it was all the more powerful because your opponent was low on cards, and now they have to deal with a 2800 beater that can snipe off the rest of the cards in their field. So these are all things that I think of when I think of old school Yu-Gi-Oh! In my mind. I don't really think of like 2002 or 2003. I think more so of like 2008 to maybe 2012 or something like that. Those were kind of my heydays of playing this game. So, what's more valuable nowadays, or what is prioritized or different? Well, obviously we have a few changes. First of all, we've got longer combos, and there's a lot that you can cite here. So, again, this is a generalization, but we've got the advent of things like extenders. That is to say, a monster usually, but it can also be like a spell, like an instant fusion type of card, or an emergency teleport type of card, or that damn quick launch that still hasn't been limited yet. But anyways, yeah, so these are just these cards or these monsters that can usually special summon themselves to start combos, and also can extend a combo if your combo gets interrupted. So it means that you are kind of encouraged to summon a lot more. You're encouraged to, kind of bear it all on the field, right? You play your hand out as opposed to holding back. In old school Yu-Gi-Oh, holding back was really key. You didn't want to hit those Mirror Forces and Torrentials. You didn't want to run into a Gorge. You didn't want to get maybe hit by some type of a field nuke. Nowadays, though, it's important what a deck can do on the first turn. It's very, that's a key aspect in how strong a deck is. It's not necessarily how well it can grind. It's not necessarily how well it can recover. Those are all important things to varying degrees, but really what a deck can put up on the first turn to protect itself or to just debilitate the opponent entirely, those are important things. So extenders are very important. Ways of stopping the next major thing, hand traps, are very important. So we've got these hand traps that kind of take on something of the role of trap cards. They can stop stuff from the hand, or they can interact from the hand. Some people will say that, they are what killed trap cards. I think that there's some merits to that idea. The thing with hand traps that you may like or may not like is that you can't really see them coming. So if we're playing and I set 2 cards face down, well, those are two known threats to you, my opponent. So you know that I have two cards I could activate. They could be bluffs, they could be an attack stopper, they could be a summon stopper, they could interact in some other way, they could be spell and trap removal. But you know what they are, and as the game goes on, and as you make plays, and I choose to activate them or don't choose to activate them, you can take that information and form a conclusion about what the rest of the cards might be. So if I have 3 cards set, and you normal summon a monster, and then you attack with that monster, and I don't use anything on it, you can start to maybe X out a few possibilities, depending on what it was I summoned, depending on the point in the game. Hand traps are different in that your opponent can't really see a hand trap coming. If I have Ash Blossom in my hand, you kind of just have to guess or assume that I have it in my hand. And that has really sort of become a norm today. Combos and decks are sort of formed around their ability to play around a hand trap. Can they, avoid Nibiru? Can they play through an Ash Blossom or an Effect Veiler at an inopportune time? Can they play through Artifact Lancia or Droll Lockbird? Those are also really powerful cards. And the hand traps, in many ways, are stronger than trap cards because they can be used during your opponent's first turn. As I just mentioned, going first has far more importance today, so hand traps were always going to be more important, commensurately, because you can't set a trap if your opponent's going first, but you do need to be able to stop these longer combos. Now, those two things aside, there's also the we'll say issue, but the concept of just the negations or kind of disruptions, whatever you'd like to call them. So basically, it's far more common to end on a board of monsters that debilitate your opponent, either preventing monster effects or just negating some type of a thing. These come in so many different forms. Obviously, you think of stuff like Borreload Savage Dragon, Crystal Wing, Apollousa, Herald of Arclight. Those are some of the more like generic ones you'll see, and then many decks have a more specific one or two that can, interact with the opponent. Ultimate Conductor Tyranno comes to mind, Shuragan Tri-Brigades, Herald of Ultimateness. These cards that, stop your opponent from making their turn. Sometimes it's a floodgate effect, sometimes it's a negation effect. It means that going first now has a number of advantages. In addition to the fact that you've got these extenders and these longer combos, you also get to be the person who makes this board largely uninterrupted if your opponent doesn't have hand traps, and then when your opponent takes their move, they're far more limited in what they can do because you can oftentimes negate all of those things, or many of those things, or at least enough such that they have to end their turn, and then on your next turn, you'll be able to basically kill them. At least that's the idea. And now, as a consequence of that happening, Konami has devised countermeasures. So obviously the hand traps are one countermeasure, and they've become a necessary evil. There are also things like kaijus, which have become pretty big deals off and on through different formats. They basically contribute an opponent's monster, regardless of whether or not that monster wants to negate it or interact with it, because the monster just gets contributed as a cost. It's a great way to deal with the Borreload Savage. It's a great way to deal with Dragoons, which can't be targeted or destroyed. So basically, you can just use a kaiju and plop it down and get rid of a threat. There are even more extreme examples. Lava Golem, which is actually an old card, kind of became more relevant here, as well as the Winged Dragon of Ra Sphere mode, which can actually get rid of multiple monsters all in one swoop, so those two have become more relevant. Also, old cards like Super Poly sometimes show up as meta calls, but the more recent Konami creations are basically cards that, as I've seen them called online, are like equalizers. This is where the Dark Ruler No Mores come in, and this is also where Nibiru, which is a hand trap, but we'll include in this conversation too, come in, and it's also where you get cards like Forbidden Droplet. Basically, more cards that are meant to help players who are going second. While you can't search for them and you have to just hard draw them, you do at least have the benefit of, getting a 6th card when you're going second, and many of these cards can't be responded to. So if you use Forbidden Droplet properly, your opponent can't respond to it, but also same goes for Dark Ruler No More, which can just completely negate a board of monsters. We even have cards like Evenly Matched and Lightning Storm, which if they resolve, can clear your opponent's board. It's kind of funny, really, because of all the negations that exist in the game. Lightning Storm and Evenly Matched rarely actually exist with the intention of resolving, but rather they're meant to be played and used as bait for your opponent's negation cards. So that's all sort of where we are. There's new and there's old. Again, at this point in the video, you might think, okay, well, Paul's just some old school player who just wants the game to revert back 10 years and get rid of all the fun I'm having today. Not exactly the case. I think that there are a lot of benefits to new school Yu-Gi-Oh! And nuances that I feel don't go fully appreciated. For instance, yes, old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Had a much longer average duel. It might take 5, 6, 7, 10 turns even. And there are a lot of interactions. But I think that this new school of Yu-Gi-Oh!, this modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, does actually offer that, but condensed down into just the 1 or 2 turns. So, when you think of how long a combo is, when you think of how hand traps can be used just from the hand without really any forewarning, and when you think of the way that combos can pivot around the existence of hand traps, playing around Nibiru, pushing through an Ash or a Veiler, even maybe being able to play under a Droll or perhaps under an Artifact Lancia, the same amount of interactions and decisions are actually being made in Yu-Gi-Oh! Just in a shorter span of time. In that first turn, and then in your opponent's second turn when they play their powerful equalizer cards, their Dark Ruler No Mores, their Forbidden Droplets, their Kaijus, whatever they have to sort of break your board and push forward. Within those 1 or 2 turns, I would argue that you're getting still an equal amount of interactions. Now, whether or not you consider those interactions to be as high quality or deep as maybe old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Really depends when you ask. But I think that there are arguments to be made with new school Yu-Gi-Oh! Where, it's a little bit more high octane in that way. It's a little bit more dynamic. It still captures a lot of that back and forth nature that, you've activated this. Well, you thought I activate this. Well, I activate this to counter your this. It's just all happening in a shorter span. And so it can look from the outside like it's just maybe too much and a little too crazy. But I think that there's some merits to that. I think that it makes games really feel a little bit less like maybe chess and more like perhaps poker, where you're kind of, I don't want to say like it's a one-to-one parallel, but having to kind of make a prediction, a bold call about what your opponent has in their hand and preparing for that. There's something there, Does your opponent even run hand traps? If they run hand traps, which ones do they run? Which ones do they have? Do they have Ash, Veiler, Gamma, Nibiru? Are they focusing more so on going second cards, just like Dark Ruler No More, Forbidden Droplets, and they're going to let your turn go through? How do you pivot around that? And then once you have your negates on the board and your opponent's taking their turn, which cards do you negate and what will get played next? It's interesting, and I think that there's some fun to be had with both. So when did this happen and how and why? My baseline time of transition for this video, I'll say, is maybe 2014. I'd say many people could agree with that. That's the Duelist Alliance era when that started, kind of in the middle of 2014. The introduction of Burning Abyss, Shaddolls, also Satellar Knights and Cleaforts, and later Necrons. Those were sort of, I'd say, the first deck themes or archetypes or whatever that had something closer to the newer style, more cards that had floaty effects, more apparent levels of +1s and card advantage and pressure gained on the opponent in the early phases of a duel. It wasn't exactly where we are today, but I think that that's kind of where the transition period started, and I think that it just sort of continued from there. Obviously, we've gotten more extra deck summoning mechanics. Things like Link Monsters have sped things up. The general power creep, which I know it's an old argument, but it's a true thing. In Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards do get faster. They do get stronger. You're sort of encouraged to play new cards because that's what you need to keep up, and it keeps the game exciting and it keeps things moving. So I'd say that's kind of when it started. And as for whether or not I think it's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm still mixed on that every day. I don't actually know exactly what I think about it. I just know that it just feels like Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a bit of a different game. I think it causes a bit of strife or friction when an older player is trying to return to the game because it's not what they knew, and it can make it a little bit difficult also to introduce a completely new player into the game because turns can be so high octane and so much can happen that if a person just learned how to play with maybe 3 copies of a structure deck, it's going to be rough, right? You're not going to be able to play through a bunch of negates, and also you're not going to be expecting your opponent's turn to take maybe 5 or 10 minutes as they just combo off and you kind of feel powerless to stop it. Once you get into that, though, I think that there's a lot of fun to be had, but I think that it makes the barrier to entry a little bit higher. Actually, maybe a lot higher. So yeah, those are basically it. That's my thoughts on Yu-Gi-Oh! I think that there are two different types of Yu-Gi-Oh! And you kind of have to be clear with yourself as to like which one you want to play. I think if you want old Yu-Gi-Oh! Then new Yu-Gi-Oh! Just isn't it, and there's not a lot of use in complaining about it or hoping that it'll go back until Konami maybe decides to do some type of legacy formats officially. I just don't see it being a thing. But you can always play that way with your friends. That's obviously where stuff like GOAT format has become very popular. But I think that they're just two different games now, and they're two different games with two different skills sets, strengths, weaknesses. I'm curious, what do you guys think? Let me know down in the comments. Which Yu-Gi-Oh do you prefer? What is your defense of both of them? Do you think one is like better than the other? And all of that. Anyways, I guess that's it. I'll see you guys in the next one. I gotta actually manually turn the camera off myself. So, yeah. Bye, guys.